Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Peterson. I'm the Senior Director here for Africa at the National Endowment for Democracy of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies. It's my privilege to welcome you today to this afternoon's presentation, A Constitution for Multinational Democratic State Nation, the Case of Ethiopia, featuring Reagan Fussell Democracy Fellow, Dr. Negaso Solan. We are also delighted to have with us as a discussant Dr. John Harbeson, professorial lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and professor of political science emeritus at the City University of New York. I'm going to read through the script that the forum has given me for this afternoon very quickly, although you can also find the biographical information in the announcement for the meeting. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan Fussell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now, in our 13th year, the program has hosted more than 200 fellows from over 80 countries since its founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to democracy in Ethiopia. Of the modern state of Ethiopia, the country's diversity, represented by its roughly 80 ethnic groups, has defied common formulas for unity and democratic development. Regimes have come and gone, but the central question, whether to forge a nation state, a multinational federation, or something else, has dominated Ethiopia's political agenda for decades. Looking ahead to the upcoming 2015 elections and the country's longer-term stability and development, Dr. Negaso Solan will focus on the need for a constitution that mirrors Ethiopia's ethnic diversity and lends itself to developing a truly democratic multinational state. As former president of Ethiopia, he will reflect on his experiences drafting the country's 1995 constitution and offer recommendations for public confidence building around future amendments. Dr. Negaso Solan is an esteemed statesman and scholar who served as president of Ethiopia from 1995 to 2001, a member of the House of People's Representatives from 2005 to 2010, and most recently as chair of the United for Democracy and Justice Party, one of Ethiopia's main opposition parties. I should say in this context that it was my privilege to meet in Addis about a year and a half ago in the offices of the UDJ, and having an opportunity to talk to him about the challenges that the opposition faces in Ethiopia was certainly a marvelous opportunity. A lifelong proponent for human rights, ethnic inclusion, and democracy, he participated in the student movement of the 1960s, led the IRA school demonstrations against the Walaga feudal system in the 1970s, and advocated for the rights of the Oromo people, Ethiopia's largest ethnic group. While living in Germany, Dr. Solan worked to unite the Oromo community both internally and with other Ethiopian groups in their struggle against military rule. Returning to his homeland in 1991, he helped to draft a new constitution, chaired the 1994 Constitutional Assembly, and signed the Constitution in 1995 as the first president of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. I think we had a reception last week, and someone noted that the endowment has never had a former head of state here. And I think not only is he exceptional as a former head of state, but in a certain sense, he, I think, could be considered the Thomas Jefferson of the modern Ethiopian state. So it's really, for us here at the National Endowment for Democracy, I think quite appropriate that we have him. John Harbeson is Professor of Political Science Emeritus in the Graduate Center in City College of City University of New York, Professorial Lecturer at Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington. He's author and editor of 11 books on African politics and development, most recently Africa and World Politics, which is going to be coming out with a 6th edition soon. He's had 2 tours in the U.S. Agency for International Development, including one as Regional Democracy and Governance Advisor for Eastern and Southern Africa, which is where I first met John, I believe, when he was doing that some many years ago. He writes a monthly column for Nairobi Law Monthly and Sunny Nation in Kenya, and has been a Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and a member of the Africa Advisory Council of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's the co-founder and was the inaugural chair of the Comparative Democratization section and the founding chair of the African Politics Conference Group, both sections of the American Political Science Association. His association with Ethiopia as scholar, USA contractor, and teacher extends over 40 years, dating from his 2 years on the faculty of Addis Ababa University in 1973 through 75. We'll now turn the floor over to Negaso, who will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by John for about 10 minutes. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents, or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NED Democracy. If you've not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved in this event, most especially Research Associate Elise Alexander. Where's Elise? Oh, there, okay. Who offered vital assistance to the fellowship project in today's presentation. Negaso.
Good afternoon, all of you who are here. First of all, I would like to thank the National Endowment for Democracy for giving me opportunity, for awarding me a fellowship to spend the last 5 months here to reflect on what I thought I was contributing to Ethiopia's democratic development. And not only of myself, but also after 20 years of the Constitution making, what were the weaknesses and what were the strengths of the Constitution in practice. And therefore, I thank again the National Endowment for Democracy. I also want to especially thank the forum, the International Forum for Democratic Studies, particularly Sally with her staff and her co-worker Xerxes, Ashley for technical and financial facilitation, and then Melissa, who organized this forum, Elise, who helped me in the last 5 months in my work, and all the other staff of the forum. Then I want to ask permission to thank the Africa team, led and cooperating with him are Eric and Johanan. I hope she is there. I don't see her now. Anyway, I thank them also. And then there are also other people who helped me, particularly the Resource Center for Democracy. These are Tim, Anna, and Emily, who not only helped you in the library, but bought books for me so that I can use them, and also copied articles for me and brought them to me, and I really thank them very much. Now, I would like also to thank Professor John Harbeson and Professor Horowitz for their comments, for their advice, and for their suggestion. And finally, not the least, but the last, I want to thank my nephew, John Solomon, who helped me in the last 5 months in many aspects. Now, after thanking all of you, and particularly all of you who are here for coming in big number to hear what I say and give me the chance to say and listen to me. Before I go into the topic, I would like to say something on the title of the presentation. My presentation is about a democratic state, a multinational state, and this I chose because I would like a constitution which guides us to make Ethiopia much better democratic. Not only that, but also to help that through this, the guidance of this constitution, that we preserve the state of Ethiopia. My presentation will be, as you see, the national question. Maybe I will not go deep into that because we don't have time. Maybe there are a few minutes at the end that we discuss on them if there are interests. Then the Ethiopian constitution, how we made it, and then the challenges we still face, and look at some articles of the constitution which are controversial, which are respected and not respected still, and then my recommendations of ideas to help in the amendment, improvement of the constitution so that we have a constitution, as I said at the beginning, which will preserve Ethiopia's state and also make Ethiopia democratic. And for this, we need a roadmap. And after the roadmap, I suggest I give my last conclusive words. Now, going back on the national question, I don't want to go on the issue at the moment, but I would like to start first, much later, about 1974. You remember the oil crisis of 1973-74? Then also you remember the big famine Ethiopia faced. And there are also the student movements earlier, and there were armed struggles in the country, so that by February, 41 years ago, by February 1974, there was mutiny of the army. Students, teachers, workers, women, and Muslim community stormed onto the street of Addis, which we say the big Ethiopian revolution took place in February 1974. And the emperor tried to solve the problems by changing the prime minister and calling on the new prime minister to make a new constitution. But that did not help, and therefore, on September 11, 1974, the military took over the country, the leadership of the country. The army, the military government, what we call Derg, tried to appease the people by introducing some reforms, such as nationalization of the land, and also because it was popular at that time, adopted socialism. And not only that, but also tried to solve the national problem by establishing autonomous states, autonomous regions and administrative regions. But all that did not help. And particularly the Eritrean liberation movement and other liberation movements continued, so that by April 1991, Eritrea was already almost independent, not internationally recognized, but under the control of Eritrean People's Liberation Movement Front. Tigray was already under the Tigray Liberation Movement, and then also other armed struggles continued in the country, so that by April, the military did not have power to control the country, and its army disintegrated, and the government almost collapsed. And it was at that time that initiatives were taken by Ambassador Cohen of the State Department of Ethiopia and the Foreign Office of Great Britain to call the representative of the military government, the representative of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and also the representative of the Tigray Liberation Front to discuss on how to solve the problem so that Ethiopia will not disintegrate, so that chaos will not take place, because this area, because of the Red Sea, was very important for international trade, geopolitical and military questions, very important, and therefore a negotiation conference meeting was called in London, and it was agreed on this meeting that the EPRDF, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, led by then by Meles, who is deceased, to establish to call as soon as possible a peace conference on which different parties and different organizations take part to formulate how Ethiopia should be run in the future. So in July 1991, a peace conference took place, and that peace conference decided on adopting a charter for the transitional government, and according to that charter, in August 1991, a transitional government was formed. And transitional government stayed in power up to 1995. Then, the achievements of the transition was first of all, the restructuring of the country into regions as a solution to the problems which I mentioned earlier, the national question. 14 regions were established, and this became the basis of the present Ethiopian federal states. Now, after the restructuring and decentralization of the country in this way, still some parties were dissatisfied, such as the Oromo Liberation Front withdrew from the transition, and others also. But another point is, what we should not forget is the Eritrean referendum took place, in which the Eritrean people decided to be independent. Then, the biggest achievement, I think, in which I participated, the biggest achievement of the time was the formulation of the constitution, which we still have. Before that, you have heard my participation in the struggle. And in 1991, August 1991, I came back from Germany from 17 years of exile and joined the transitional government. And while being a minister at the same time, also being a member of the transitional parliament, the parliament chose me with another person from the EPRDF to be member of the 37-man Constitution Drafting Commission. We drafted the Constitution and presented it to a Constitution Assembly, which sat and deliberated on the articles in December, end of November up to December 1994. You see, I tried at that time, I was chairing the assembly, I tried that the assembly deliberations be democratic as much as possible. I even had sometimes difficulties with my own party, the ruling party, because I gave enough right to the opposition in the assembly. I had a little bit problem, but it was democratic according to my view, my thought. Anyway, the Constitution was adopted, and particularly Article 39. Article 39, which says all nations and nationalities, peoples in Ethiopia have the right to self-determination. Not only self-determination, but going as far as seceding and establishing their own independent state. At that moment, the House, 547 people from the 547 districts of Ethiopia who were on the meeting, rose up and danced in the hall. And that was a big moment for me also. I'm proud of that. So, after approving the Constitution, the members or the representatives of the different nationalities came forward and expressed their views. And after that, on behalf of the Assembly, I submitted the Constitution to the then President of Ethiopia, later the Prime Minister Meles, to establish a permanent government as soon as possible. And then when that government was formed in August 1995, the Parliament proclaimed it as a supreme law of the country. Now, after that, we thought problems are solved, but still there are challenges, different kinds of challenges, political, economic, social. One of the challenges we have in Ethiopia is that 80 ethnic groups exist in Ethiopia. It's beautiful, as I always said when guests and ambassadors came to my office to see me. I always said Ethiopia is very beautiful, with a bouquet, with a flower, with different colors. We are proud of being so different in a way. Different cultures, different features, and so forth and so forth. But at the same time, it is a challenge to hold 80 ethnic groups together, particularly with different interests and aims. This is one of the challenges we face up to now. Then another challenge is ethnic conflicts and clashes, or land, acquisition of land, water, pasture. There are such contradictions between some ethnic groups, and clashes take place, and those who suffer from these clashes are women, children, and old men, as you see on the picture. Now, another challenge is that we still have, even though we don't hear much on the media, even though some claim that there is no problem in Ethiopia, there are armed movements in Ethiopia. I don't want to go into the different armed struggles, list them, but at least to mention the Gambella, the Afar, the Oromo, and then also the Ogaden Liberation Movement, National Liberation Movement. And also, recently, there is an Amhara movement. And there is Tigray People's Democratic Movement. These are ethnic-based, but the last two, which you see on the list, the Patriotic Front and Gimbot 7, are the organizations which are not ethnic-based, but pan-Ethiopian. We face a challenge on this problem. Then also, these organizations are supported, some of them are supported by outside forces from Eritrea, also from Al-Shabaab in Somalia. This is a big challenge we are facing. Then also is the problem among the elite or the leaders of the different political parties. Their rigid stance, the elite, at least don't accept two things. One is on the national question, whether nations are going to separate or Ethiopia should exist, whether these two problems can be solved. They don't agree on this point. That is the point that they are not the ones to decide. It is not the parties who should decide. It is the people who should decide. They forget this. They are rigid. Then there is also the question of ideology, political, economic, social. There is difference, among different parties and the opposition parties and the government. I think for me, what I think is that it is not they who decide for the people. It is the people through election who should decide for themselves. So this is one other challenge, is this difficulty we have with political parties. Then also the question of extractive economy, that is, there is a big corruption in the country. There is also nepotism. What here I heard neo-patrimonial or, yeah? Neo-patrimonial. Yeah. So we have such problem there. And then also there is a dilemma we have. Ethiopia is poor. We want economic development. We want modernization. But at the same time, there are different ethnic groups which we would like to see them exist further with their tradition, culture, and so forth. Now, which one? The economic development or the preservation of these traditional societies? This is a challenge. Then, after 2005 election, where 200 people were killed on the streets of Addis, where the present ruling party almost lost the election, and there was a problem which arose because of the result of the election. After that, after people were killed, after the leaders of the opposition party were imprisoned for 2 years, then the parliament, which is dominated by the ruling party, made different laws. These are the parties law, civic societies law, media law, election board law, the code of conduct for parties, and anti-terrorism law. These are considered to be by many to be repressive and oppressive. This is also a challenge. Now, after these challenges, what I wanted to say is, to present is about the Constitution, a little bit about the Constitution itself. We have Constitution's articles which are controversial up to now, very controversial. One is, the Constitution says we have nations. In the preamble and throughout the Constitution, we see nations, nationalities, and peoples. This is one side. But there are Ethiopians who say, why should we say that? We have a nation, Ethiopian nation. We have one people. How come is there such difference, listing of dividing of the people? This is one controversial issue in Ethiopia. Then also the flag. The Ethiopian basic flag is green, yellow, and red. Originally, I think, brought forward by the Orthodox Church, but later the monarchy put its symbol, the Lion of Judah, and the Star of David. Then also the military, with its ideology of socialism and maybe party of the farmers. And then finally we have the present flag, which is which should represent the unity of different ethnic groups or nationalities, nations, committed to live together. This is what we formulated in the Constitution at that time. But there are many people who think that this is the flag of the EPRDF, the ruling party. Then also, there is another article which is still controversial. That is the question of political power. The Constitution has presented that our system should be majoritarian system. I think this system does not fit the situation of Ethiopia with the different cleavages. I think it is better if we could adopt the proportional representation system in our election. There are many other controversial issues of the Constitution, but I think this is all enough for the moment. Then also, parts of the Constitution which are not still properly respected are, for me, Article 9, whether it is government officials, people in the institutions, political parties, and citizens have not yet properly accepted the supremacy of the Constitution. There are many violations, examples of many violations, which could be discussed later. Then Articles 10, 11, and Chapter 3, very beautifully written on the question of the respect of the right of human rights and democratic rights and civil rights. But there are some examples of violation of these rights. And then also Article 54 and 61, they say that minorities should be represented at different levels of government organs, particularly in the parliament. For me, I have not seen. Maybe I have not been able to see that, but in the parliament, in the federal parliament, I don't see extra representation of minorities in the parliament. Now, after saying this, a few recommendations which I would suggest for discussion in the government among the parties and the public. My recommendations are, for example, that we should have constitutional court. When we made the constitution, we thought, how can we give political questions, interpretation of the constitution to individual judges? We said this should not be. Now, after 20 years, 21 years, I see that we made a mistake at that time. A party can dominate the parliament or the House of Federation and can manipulate the constitution or controversial issues in its own interest. Therefore, it is better to have a constitutional court or find a way in which the Supreme Court independently decides on the Constitution, interprets. By the way, we should have independent courts. The Constitution says courts are independent, but practically there are questions. Anyway, then the enforcement of the Constitution provisions. We can have very beautiful Constitution articles, but if they are not practiced, if they are not enforced, it's a paper tiger. And therefore, we should have provisions which provide that the Constitution should be enforced somehow. Then also the proportional representation and power sharing system, which I earlier mentioned. And then after that, we should have also an enforcement of enforcement system, mechanisms, the tenets of the Constitution, democracy, that are representation, inclusion, transparency, accountability. These are mentioned in the Constitution somehow, but practically there are still deficiencies and so on. And therefore, we should have some mechanisms of enforcing this. Then India, Switzerland, Lebanon, South Africa. These countries follow a system which is called, a democratic system which is called consociational. I think we could adopt some of the ideas of consociational democracy and good practice from these countries. And then there is also recommendation of experts for state nations. State nations are where the country is multinational, but live in a state together. There are suggestions from experts which are very good. In our case, between a compromise between the two extremists, the separatists and the Ethiopian nationalists. There are good examples which experts are giving, and we can learn a lot from them also. This said, we should have some kind of roadmaps. I suggest, this is my suggestion. I don't have power to, to implement this, but I can give my ideas, and people who hear it may take them or not. But whatever the case, on the timeline, I suggest two things. One is a confidence building steps, time for confidence building between the government and the opposition, between the people and the parties. There is no confidence. We should somehow try to find ways of building confidence among them. If there is no confidence between these forces, I think it is very hard even to practice, leave alone to amend the constitution, but in practice. Then also, timeline for constitutional amendment. I suggest that it is too late already. It would have been much better if we had an amended constitution up to now, before the next election in May. But the next election is in 2020. So until then, I hope that the constitution will be amended so that we have a better election in 2020. There are actors to whom I would appeal. There are tasks that these actors could do. The first one is the parliament itself. The parliament has given, proclaimed the 5 laws which I mentioned earlier. I think it's better if the parliament could discard or amend those post-2005 laws. And then also the current parliament should begin discussing on the constitutional review and amendment. Then the other actor is the government. I think it would be much helpful if the government could release the political prisoners that are leaders of Muslim communities, journalists, bloggers, and party leaders who are in prison, sentenced to prison, being said to have violated the anti-terrorist law. I think it would be good if the government considers whether they should be released or not. Then the question I raised earlier about Article 9, the supremacy of the Constitution, is very important. Then political parties have also duties or tasks to accomplish. That is, if they could overcome the tradition of rigidity, exclusionary doctrine and practice, and to solve political problems. You cannot solve administratively or with armed struggle. Political problems can be solved only politically. And for political solutions, what we could do is struggle done violently and peacefully. Then the private and public media have also their tasks to accomplish. That is, begin from now on, private and public media, from now on, to start giving coverage to the question of the Constitution. Then the current parliament will end its work in June, on June 30th, Ethiopian calendar, and the coming parliament will start its work after October 2015. And so, the upcoming parliament can call an inclusive consultative conference on the constitution. Parties who are at home and who are in the diaspora, religious leaders, representatives, prominent Ethiopians. I think if they could come together and discuss on the constitution, the problem of constitution, and then if the parliament could do that, calling this kind of conference, and then also finally after that form a body which could revise or suggest an amendment constitution, draft amended constitution, and then finally that constitution amendment should be presented or forwarded to the people for referendum. Then, as a conclusion, you see the constitution and the 9 nations and nationalities which have their own flags. These are the federal states which the constitution provides. And this is the constitution, the national question, the nationalities, nations, nationalities, and peoples every year on the 9th of December come to the street of Addis or capital cities of the different regions, and at the embassies here in Washington, New York, throughout the world, that day is celebrated. December 9th is celebrated as the Day of Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples of Ethiopia. This is good, but for me, the constitution should get importance also, attention also, and therefore it should be questioned whether that day, December 9, when the constitution was signed, should be the Day of Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples, or Constitutional Day. This should be asked. Now, before ending my presentation, I would like to conclude by sending a message. I see many brothers and sisters from Ethiopia. There are many people, Americans and others, who are friends of Ethiopia. I think they can help us to send this message to Ethiopia, here to the Ethiopians, and then at home. And this message I would give, and that is repeating a section of my speech on December 12, 1994, on the occasion of inaugurating the Constitution. After 6 weeks of deliberation, we inaugurated the Constitution. And at that time, I said, our focus next shall be on the implementation of issues which found settlement in the Constitution. We face the task of establishing a government which will build the new Ethiopia under the guidance of the Constitution. The task requires the active participation of all peoples of Ethiopia. Unless a government that respects and enforces the Constitution is established, there is no doubt that the aspirations affirmed in the Constitution will be emasculated. Since the establishment of a popular government is, above all, the responsibility of the populace and requires their mobilization, the Assembly calls upon all citizens to register and vote in full force to elect their representatives in the following election. That was 41 years ago, 20 years ago. But in May this year, election is going to take place. And I think the same message should be directed again. And thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Negaso. Those were really, I think, very inspiring words, very articulate. I think you've set out a real roadmap for Ethiopia, for democracy in Ethiopia. John?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Negaso, for a comprehensive, eloquent presentation, with which I'm in broad agreement. I want to make a few comments about the history that Dr. Negaso has presented, and a few comments about the challenges that he so clearly articulated. I think there's some important paradoxes and contradictions in Ethiopia's modern history that need to be highlighted. The fact that Ethiopia, in some sense, has always been a nation of one people in a certain sense, even though there have been plenty of times when it could have fallen apart, and it didn't. So that part's not really at issue. The nation part of state-nation is not really at issue. The problem is the state part of that. And I would argue that the terms of association as a state have never been democratically negotiated or ratified. I may differ a little bit with Negaso on the Constituent Assembly in '95, because I think that took place in very much of a one-party atmosphere, and so it was never really a fully democratic process. And that presents the paradox of clearly a strong ruling regime that's been very, very powerful, but presiding over that in certain respects is still quite weak. I think that's the stability. And that points to, I think, another broader point, which is that as a practical matter, state stability in the current era, at least in Africa, is really dependent upon democracy and citizen empowerment in a way that Max Weber never really understood or cared about. And that in turn points to the fact that where theories of democracy in the state and development are kind of laid out sequentially in most of the literature, the reality is that they have to be taking place all simultaneously. And that says a lot about the role of democracy in state building. So that's really the first kind of paradox. The second is Dr. Negaso talked about the '74 revolution, when I had the privilege of being in Ethiopia during that time. And it really was started out as a liberal democratic revolution along the lines Dr. Negaso is talking about right now. And it got hijacked, I think, by brothers. It got hijacked by the military and taken in a very different direction. Dr. Negaso talked about war in all directions in his talk. But that masks essentially some fundamental issues of how you build a modern post-imperial state in Ethiopia that have never really been satisfactorily brokered. The war was over a question of the transformation of the feudal economy before democracy or afterwards. The negotiations with Eritrea or suppressing it by its independence by force, military leadership of a transition versus civilian rule right now, and also implicitly following the Soviet or the Western model of state and nation development. And the third kind of stage comes in 1991, 1995 during the transition, which I would argue begged most of those state formation questions. That ethnic confederalism, which I think is, I would say intrinsically, was a very plausible idea for Ethiopia, although it's still profoundly controversial, and Dr. Negaso did not really mention that. But it essentially has been an imposed solution, never really was itself democratically agreed on, and so it remains profoundly controversial. And the transition also fell apart, I think. It became less of a transition than it was supposed to be because of the question of how you do DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, which was done essentially top-down by the EPRDF, which is why the OLF rebelled and why most of southern Ethiopia is not of this regime. And so it never really went away. And the ruling party itself and also the opposition parties have been essentially coalition parties rather than really pan-national parties. So that brings me then to some contemporary challenges. I think Dr. Negaso articulated very well, so I just have a few points. I think some of the issues of state formation that I've just mentioned are still present. This notion of a developmental state that's kind of the flavor of the month in some of the literature, as principally economic development as before, both politically and economically, I think is still very much at issue as it was, as it has been in the past. And preserving the state versus counterterrorism, I think that's a very dramatic concern. Article 39 that allowed it set up essentially ethnic confederalism and allowed still allows theoretically for actually autonomy up to and reaching the point of independence under certain conditions, I think is still profoundly controversial and really unbrokered to this day. And in more terms, I think there's a sense that both the ruling party itself and the opposition parties are really are either mono-ethnic or they're sort of coalitions of ethnic communities rather than really, and they may be coalitions at regional levels, but the idea of pan-national parties at a national level, I think, is something that has yet to be accomplished. I think the UDJ that Dr. Negaso chaired for a time has made a valiant effort in that direction, but it shows that the terms of association and the horizontally really have not been fully established, and that's a major source of state weakness. Dr. Negaso talked about the code of conduct. I think codes of conduct for parties is a terrific idea, but they have to be shared terms, negotiated terms, and they have to be co-enforced, whereas in the Ethiopian case, that code of conduct has been sort of a hammer that's been used to pound. So it's a good code of conduct, but poorly and undemocratically implemented. I have to mention, as Dr. Negaso really did not, is the importance of civil society in this equation. We've talked about civil society sort of mother's milk for the last 20 years in the literature on democratization, and it's been chipped away at in Kenya to some degree, but particularly in Ethiopia. The Charities and Societies Act, Organization Act, all but strips civil society of any significant importance politically. The role of civil society advocacy for democracy has all been squashed by that law, and it needs to go. And I certainly agree with Dr. Negaso about media freedom and the release of political prisoners. I'm a political scientist, and we quibble about things like elections, but I do think proportional representation is a good idea, but it has its pluses and minuses. So I think some fine tuning perhaps in that area would be welcome. And lastly, in economic terms, the high point, the happiest I ever saw people or a city in '75 was when the land of the tiller law was adopted. It was really a joyous occasion I've never seen since. And that's been corrupted and badgered and messed around with. And I haven't looked at the land tenure in Ethiopia in detail in many years, but it has to be a complete mess. And so that's another foundational dimension of African economies and states that just needs to be I can't fail to mention what is parochially referred to as the land grabs, but essentially the allocation of large swaths of land to foreign corporations and states for development. Ethiopia is one of the prime participants in that process. Last I saw, as of 2010, I haven't seen anything since, something like 600,000 hectares of land developed that way, and that's created a great deal of displacement. And I'm a Kenya hand as well as an Ethiopia hand, and I have to mention the dams that the Ethiopians are building, not just on the Nile, but also on the Omo in the southwest, which have the possibility of displacing not only large numbers of vulnerable Ethiopian populations, but messing up Lake Turkana and the lives of pastoral communities in northwestern Kenya. So I think that's my litany of concerns and paradoxes that I believe for the audience to discuss. And thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I think you've filled in a lot of spaces in Dr. Negaso's presentation and added some more food for thought. I think we can open it up for questions now. There are a lot of people here that know Ethiopia very well, and so I'm expecting that we'll have some good questions. I see one here and then one in the far back.
Thank you very much. Lawrence Freeman from Africa Desk at Executive Intelligence Review. I recently visited Ethiopia in November after meeting with the Lake Chad Basin Commission and was very impressed on some of the policies of economic development. I think sometimes the human rights groups and democracy groups miss the point that life, sustaining human beings with food and water and electricity, is the fundamental human right. And I wanted to ask the former president, I had a chance to meet with Simone Baraket, who briefed me on the history of the fight that took place in Ethiopia in 2001 to push out several portions of the party and go ahead with a policy for development. I think they called it not managing poverty, but eradicating poverty. Poverty is the #1 enemy. And the development around the country, which I toured, is massive for infrastructure, roads, water, electricity. So I wanted to ask the former president what he thought about the role of economic development in the state of Ethiopia and the future of Ethiopia.
We'll take this other question. Goes back here and then Dr. Negaso answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Negaso. It was a very good presentation. I got one question. I heard your recommendations regarding some changes on the constitution. So you mentioned about the issue of the constitutional court changed, and also you mentioned some issues regarding political power. So do you have any other recommendations regarding other controversial articles of the constitution? For example, the issue of self-determination, language, and also the power of the prime minister, and maybe specifically those controversial article on Article 39, the self-determination issue. If you do have any other recommendations on changing these articles, what would that be? Thank you very much.
Yeah, from
African Intelligence Review, I think that is, yeah. African Intelligence Review.
thank you for the question. Good that you discussed with Ato Simon Berakat. Then the question is whether the development of 2001, when important members of TPLF were ousted. I say again, that's why I had a problem with the EPRDF. See, the constitution of the party says any change in the central committee or executive committee will be decided by the General Assembly of the party, by the General Assembly. And this did not take place. It was cadres who were called in Makale in January 2000, who expelled those people. And in fact, that was the time when I said, who was reporting, the chairman of the party, Tomalles, was reporting the incident in Makale, where he said, we have chased those people out. We have jackets and sent them to the streets naked. I don't know if Ato Barakat told you about that. But I said, the way Ato Malles bragged on this incident reminded me of a film, documentary film, which was shown maybe up to now, shown every year, of President Mengistu, who at one time at the university was bragging. He kicked their ass with what do you huh? Yeah. And I said, Atomeles, you talk reminds me or is similar to that. Whatever the case, it was at that time that I also left because the way the party was developing, saying it should use, Ato Simon was the one who was suggesting that the party was not using the state power, that is the army, the parliament, the bureaucracy, the security. The party was not using these organs and should use those organs systematically. And that is what is being done up to now. That there is no separation between the party and the government. Anyway, that's the one question, but the other question is about the economic development. I think, I don't know, if you go to Addis, you will see high buildings. You will see very good roads, but at the same time, please go on Sundays to the Orthodox Church fences. 300, 2,000 beggars sitting under the walls of the fences of the Orthodox Church, begging. Please also see, I don't know if you have seen, on the streets of Addis, between the two lanes of the street, how many people spend the night there? How many people spend the night on verandas? What is the relation of those high buildings and those who have it, and the mass of the people who don't have anything to eat and go to the garbages every morning looking if there is something to eat? This is one aspect. But on the other hand, I don't deny, which is very good also, there are more clinics, there are more health stations, there are more schools, and in 1991 there was, I think, 2 or 3 universities. Now we have, I think, 32 or something, yeah, which should be appreciated, actually. This is what I think on the economic development of our friend you asked it. This is what I think. There are pros and contras. Yeah. For the Constitution, there are other, as I said earlier, there are other points which I didn't list here. The term, for example, how long should the Prime Minister be in take leadership? The problem is that's where I try to explain about this majoritarian system. You see, it is who decides on the Prime Minister is not the, it's not the people or the parliament itself. It is the party which has the majority of the seats in the parliament, who will suggest who should be the Prime Minister. And as long as the party wants someone to be the Prime Minister, he can't be Prime Minister for life. That's a situation which is given now. And I think also, maybe you are hinting, asking me if I support that system which exists or not. Also like you, it's good if the Prime Minister wouldn't be in office or function. There should be some kind of amendment. This is one thing. The other thing, Article 39. If you ask me personally, I'm for Article 39. Right of self-determination up to and including cessation, independence. I'm for that. We did that we put it in the Constitution, being confident that the people, if they get their rights respected, will not secede. will not choose independence. If their rights, economic, social, and political rights are respected, they will choose unity. And that is what is going on in Ethiopia. Maybe there are some parties, small parties, or liberation movements, which still claim that they want independence or secession for their people. But if the people get the chance to say what they want, I don't think they will choose for secession or independence. And interestingly, I'm an Oromo, and I hear and read in many private newspapers and websites about the Oromo. Yeah, the Oromo are the biggest group in Ethiopia. They ask for their rights respect. But I know that if we today go and ask the Oromo people what do they want, they would say no to secession and independence. Now what I want to say is that this is why I mentioned 39 is a controversial article, not because I don't support it, but because I support it. The question is whether I, as a supporter of that article, or those who oppose that article, give the chance, they first of all explain to our people, to the people of Ethiopia, on what we think, those who oppose it or support it. First, explain this to the people, and then ask them, after hearing us, they decide themselves in a referendum. That is what is not given up to now. What Professor Harbeson said, we have not negotiated democratically. That means democratically negotiating means asking the people to decide. And if the people decide for unity, if you ask, if you respect the people, then you accept, the people, the majority, then you accept what they say. Of course, you will maybe continue to agitate for that for Quebec, what is going on in Quebec. Yeah? But you can raise that once and continue to raise that, but once it is decided, everybody should accept, respect that. And myself, even though I support that article, if the people decide in a referendum otherwise, I will respect what the people have decided. That's what I want to say.
Three quickies. That incident that Dr. Negaso mentioned in back 2002, that's way above my pay grade, but I think we have to recognize that Eritrea was a big part of that discussion and a big part of the, and I would just say that I think that's the Ethiopian, Eritrea separation, that's still an unhealed wound for much of Ethiopia. Second, in some respects, Article 39 has been put into effect. I mean, there really are regional governments. Some of them are very strong. The problem is that the party, EPRDF, is, although it's a coalition of parties, is a very strong and dominant party. So a lot of the EPRDF's action countermand the effects of constitutional federation. And the third point I would mention in terms of poverty and so forth, if you look at the numbers of Gini indexes of inequality, Ethiopia is the lowest in the world at 29 or 30. It's unbelievable, and I don't believe it. You look around you, and it just doesn't. And there is, of course, the fact that the EPRDF has its hands in the major parts of the economy. I hope there aren't any World Bank people here, but if they are, I guess I'm suggesting that the numbers may be a little screwy. Anyway, let's go with that.
Good, okay, let's see, we've got a lot of hands going up now. I see the man in the light blue shirt here raised his first, the man in the brown jacket over here, and the man with the dark blue jacket.
We started something.
That's two people, I think, and I'm afraid we're running short on time here too, so if you could please keep your questions short.
So I'm very grateful, and I am an admirer of President Negaso. However, this is my third time here. I came here when Brutukan spoke, then I came when Marara spoke, and I appreciate, and I may say, if President Reagan did something great, I think Ned is one of his biggest achievements. So I welcome Ned. But I want to ask one question to the two, but I also want to ask one question to Ned. First, I want to say the Ethiopian constitution has three defects. One is ownership. Anybody who knows Ethiopian politics, including Dr. Nagado, the constitution is a document of the victorious party against the losers. As you guys know, when the constitution was made, the Ethiopians, people who identify themselves as Ethiopians and as Amaras, two different groups, were not part of that picture. So the constitution, in terms of ownership, does not represent some of us. Number two is the whole constitution, if you look at it, or the 1991 Peace and Reconciliation Convention, if you look at it, it is clearly the rhetoric in the room, plus the parties that were celebrating the defeat of one group of people against the others. The third one is the most important difference is no Ethiopian, organized or unorganized, rejects the existence of Ethiopian nations, nationalities. But what we believe is Ethiopia should be a covenant between individual citizens, where citizens, irrespective of their ethnic or national origins, value politics in terms of their political interest and values, but not in terms of blood lineage or identity politics. So with that said, I again want to compliment President Negaso. But what I want to ask, Ned has been giving opportunities to Ethiopians a lot, and I appreciate that. Can we also invite Ethiopians who believe, like the United States, where individual rights becomes the principle on which a nation is be founded, so that we can have discussions like this? I thank you very much.
To the extent that that last question, I think, was directed at Ned, I'm not sure I understand exactly. Can the endowment invite Ethiopians to have these kinds of discussions? We're having one such discussion here today, but
I am saying where people who believe in individual rights as opposed to ethnic
so, I mean, in other words, a discussion that would be focusing on that exact question, individual rights. I mean, I don't know how Negaso feels about individual rights. Certainly, that's something that we do promote here at the endowment with our program around the world, Africa and Ethiopia included. I think the promotion of individual rights is really fundamental to what we believe as Americans what democracy is. So we're definitely working on it. Negaso, did you want to say some things?
Yeah. And that's what I said. The cleavage between parties, let's say myself and the ruling party, read that there should be a collective respect or collective know, which should come first is the individual, the liberals. There are people who I can count parties, a lot of parties which are working or agitating for the priority be given to the individual, the individual and so on. But just to mention, you said this is your third time. Burtukan, who was here, was he not a believer in the liberal democracy? Anyway, as for the constitution dancing, the women you saw on the field, in the slide, he's from Gondar, from Amhara. And whatever the case, it was not in this line why I criticized the process of making of the constitution. Ethnic groups were represented at that time. Enough. The only weakness I would like to mention, I've mentioned before also, that when we discussed on the principles of the constitution, the people who gathered to discuss on the constitution principles, not articles, were not enough. It's a few in the community who discussed on them. The second is major parties. I don't know if I've mentioned earlier. Major parties like EPRP and All Ethiopia Socialist Movement, and different from what happened in East Europe. In our case, the Ethiopian Workers' Party and then OLF did not participate in the process of constitution making. That is where I agree with you that it was not inclusionary. But on the question of ethnic, the Amhara were definitely have participated, definitely, because I was there.
That's right. I neglected to let the other two questions go ahead. So over here, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have two brief comments and three short questions. The first comment would be on the flag of Ethiopia. The flag of Ethiopia is a tricolor, green, yellow, and red. The ones you mentioned with the lion is not a national flag, but a crown flag. Let's just put that in perspective. And before going to my second comment, I think I would like to ask Mr. Negaso the circumstances and the processes followed to make this constitution. As you know, 1/7 of the population was disenfranchised when this constitution was made, and it is, to be brief, a Stalinist constitution that allows any power that comes to power, not only the EPRDF or any other party coming to power, using this constitution will not do anything different than what EPRDF. This is fundamentally a Stalinist constitution that denies individual liberties. It's not worth the paper it's written on. The second point is, as you know, when you talked about amendments, Dr. Negaso, as you know, Article 105 clearly indicates that this constitution is not to be amended. It's impossible to amend this constitution as it's written. under Article 105. The second question I would like to ask you, Dr. Negaso, is don't you think much of the undemocratic nature of this governing party emanates from the very organizing principles of the organization? A very sectarian, ethnic-based organization, as any other organization that is, by its very nature, discriminatory and, in fact, a members-only club. So this kind of organizing principle to any group will not be conducive to having a democratic nation building. It will not be helping any democratic nation building process. And the second, last question I would like to ask you, Dr. Negaso, is I haven't heard you talk about national reconciliation. Don't you think this is a very fundamental issue that we need to look into and revisit and have an urgent appeal on conducting a national reconciliation on a national level? Thank you.
So, there was the question from the man back here in the blue. Yes. Right here. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to come here. Two quick questions. One is just purely out of curiosity. I don't have any opinion, but just to ask all three of you if you want. How do you think the Ethiopian story will play out? Just if you can just play a movie, this is always going to fold out. Just your opinion or your prediction. I'm curious to hear that. Also, the speaker talked about the need for change in the constitution. What do you think will be the motivation for the ruling party to change anything, if any? So those are my questions. Thank you.
The first question about how the play, maybe others could answer, answer that. I'm not able to answer that because I'm not, how can I say, right, I mean, drama writer or something. But whatever the case, the motivation of the ruling party, there is no incentive, motivation on changing the status quo. This we know. That's where I say the ruling party should think over. It can have whatever ideology it wants. I'm not saying EPRDF should drop its revolutionary democracy. It is its right to have that. It can't claim to be a dominant party. It can't claim a development party. It is its right. Those who oppose this, for me, are not correct. The question is whether that party also allows other parties to have their own ideology and also equally, fairly, like it is, using the, in the system, could organize and could be free and agitate for their way of thinking or not. That is where we should criticize the EPRDF, I think. As for the incentive, I think it can't go on like this forever. At some time, the ruling party should think twice. If not, there will be problem. But I think this discussion on medias, and now the campaigns which started yesterday for the election, I hope uh, this will have effect on the people. As I said, it is the people who control the parties also. And I think this could be a chance. I hope that from the opposition, some organization, I mean, some individuals, members will be elected to participate in the next uh, parliament. And also, I think we should also think of Ethiopia. It is a patriarchal country. It is aristocratic, thinking of aristocracy. And it takes a lot of time to democratize the country, the society. So institutions must change slowly. And I think that's the incentive I see, but there is no other way. I don't recommend armed movement to get rid of the government, because we have seen it in the last 20 years. In Eritrea, an armed organization has come to power. It doesn't want to give up power. In Ethiopia, the same thing. In Uganda, the same thing. In Rwanda, the same thing. So that's why I recommended it is better that we adopt a peaceful and non-violent way. That's one point. About Article 105, I think we misunderstood, or may I say respectfully, that one has to read the Constitution properly, correctly. It says there are articles in the Constitution which are not to be amended very simply. These are Chapter 3 and Article 39. These cannot be amended very easily. It has, yeah. That's what I want to say, but not all our Constitution. Yeah. The organizing principle, I said, the organizing principle of an organization, why should we go into that? It can organize as in any way it wants. Yeah, it's up to us to choose it or not. And the second question is whether it allows other organizations to be organized in the way they want. So I don't go into the type of organization of EPRDF or not. I mean, this is no problem, I think. And the question of the Constitution, it's not also correct to say the Constitution was EPRDF Constitution or Stalinist Constitution. Because, as I mentioned, there were 37 people in the drafting commission. 7 were from the parliament. And from the parliament, 7 people, only 2 of us were from EPRDF. And there was nobody from TPLF in the constitution drafting. This must be a fact which is missing. You can hate TPLF, I don't care. But the question is, Ato Kifle Wadajo, well-known liberalist, was the chairman of the Constitution Commission. of a drafting commission. Of course, Dawit and myself fought in any way we could to have Article 39 respected. I mean, to be taken into the Constitution, but that was not by the Constitution Commission, drafting commission was not accepted. What happened was there were two versions of the article, which were presented to the transitional parliament, and the transitional parliament debated on these two versions. Because it did not agree, finally it was taken to the Constitutional Assembly. It was a long process. It was only on that, maybe you will say it is Stalinist, but other parts are not. And as for the question, I don't know whether it is here also, whether it is in net or in the US or wherever it is. The question of self-determination is also a liberal right, an individual right. The question of self-determination. This is my belief. But the question is, when it comes to the question of separation or not, this, for me, what we did argue in the 1960s in the student movement is, when we raise the question of self-determination, it does not mean that we support separation. Democratically, to decide on different alternatives. There can't be alternative of separation. There can't be alternative of confederation. There can't be an alternative of federation. There can't be an alternative of unity. This is how we democratically should solve the problem, by asking the people, which do you want? This is what I think. Yeah.
Good.
Just four quickies on the APRD of Constitution. I do disagree a little bit with Negaso, and I do think that that Constitution was passed in a one-party atmosphere, which is why I say that it was never really democratically negotiated. On Article 39, the fact that this is still, I think, a profoundly controversial article, and to say that it's not entrenched, to say that it is entrenched, I think, points to the real problem the country faces. And on the question of individual versus, I think in African democracies, the reality is you have to have both national reconciliation, which means reconciliation of groups, and you have to have individuals involved. And how you balance that is an ongoing problem. It's not just for Ethiopia. And the last question is the motivation for EGARDF to change. I do think there's something called the authoritarian trap, which is damned if you do and damned if you don't. I'll leave it at that.
Again, I must say we've ran over by about 15 minutes or more.
Got 2 hours to go, don't we?
Yeah. So I don't know what the policy is. Forum. Are we allowed to continue a little bit longer? Certainly people should feel free to go if they want to do that, but I know there are a lot of hands here, people eager to ask some questions, so I can go ahead and do that if it's acceptable. No, okay, I'm advised that it's better to wrap up. So I'm very sorry about that.
Where did that come from? I didn't see that.
I saw it. So
it wasn't from Sally.
It's a shame because I know that the debate was just beginning to get some steam here, and it was going to be very engaging and exciting. But we have gone on quite a long time now. Maybe I'll just try to sum it up in terms of the question about the sort of scenario. Youth Endowment, I think disappointed with the way things were going in Ethiopia after 2005 in particular, that there was a great erosion of freedom. I think what Dr. Has been describing for us this afternoon is really a sort of way out. I don't know what incentives the government might find to take his suggestion seriously, but it seems to me that compared to some of the other alternatives, that it really is worth greater debate and discussion within Ethiopia. So, Dr. Negaso, do you want to say some concluding words? John?
I'm done. That's all. I don't want.
Okay, I guess
Thank you very much for the chance.
it's been a great privilege, of course, to have Dr. Negaso and John, and for everyone that has been able to participate this afternoon. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.